The Canon EOS R7 is a camera that I've been waiting for Canon to come out with for quite a while now. When Canon released the EOS R5 and R6, having really good internal 10-bit video codecs and amazing autofocus, I knew that their crop sensor camera that they eventually would come out with would be great. In today's video, I'm going to review the Canon EOS R7, but primarily from a video perspective, because I bought this camera specifically to use on video gigs, also to use for YouTube. If this is the first time you're on this channel, my name is Geoff Fagien. I'm a filmmaker, director of photography, and a videographer based in South Florida. I do various projects from commercials to real estate, social media videos, short films, narrative. You may have seen my video about the Red Komodo, and if you haven't, I'll put a link in the description below, and how the Red Komodo is what I use primarily for my narrative work. Now that I'm back here down in South Florida, it actually pushed me into the direction of Canon mirrorless, and even though I still keep the Komodo, it's actually right there behind me, I have moved towards Canon mirrorless for all of my videography work, especially because it just makes your life so much easier. Now, until now, I've primarily been using the Canon EOS R6. However, when the R7 came out, that's the camera we're using right now, and I have been using it for not only all of my YouTube videos, but pretty much for any kind of video content I do that needs a really good quality camera and it's staying on a tripod. I'm going to go over the camera and talk about the pros and the cons of ownership of this camera, because although the specs are really great, and for the most part, the Canon EOS R7 is a fantastic camera. There are some minor cons though that you'll never really hear about or think about until you actually start using this camera and start encountering them and realize that the EOS R7 is useful in a lot of situations, but there are specific situations where you may want to use a different camera or different video modes. When the R7 and the R10 were first released, I actually picked up the R10 instead of the R7, at least on the pre-order stage, because the R10 had a lot of the similar features of the R7. However, it was a lower megapixel sensor. It was also missing C-Log3, but it did shoot 4K 60 up to 10-bit, although the 4K 60 mode was only available in its crop mode. The biggest thing for me was the no image stabilization of the R10, as since I have the R6 and that's a camera with image stabilization, there are certain situations that filmmakers do not want image stabilization, especially if you're going to mount a camera on a car. Even with image stabilization off, because of how it works, when you put a camera that has image stabilization in situations that have super heavy vibrations, well then the footage ends up getting messed up. So that's why the R10 seemed like the way for me to go. But then as I started looking into it, missing C-Log3 was going to be a huge deal, so I ended up picking up the R7 instead, which is no slouch. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are looking to pick up the Canon R7 as a B camera, and it is very solid as a B camera. I mean, having C-Log3, being able to match it pretty easily with other cameras like the R6, the R5, the R5C, the C70, all of those cameras do have the ability to shoot in C-Log3, especially when not shooting in RAW, so it makes the ability to match between all of those cameras pretty seamless. The EOS R7 has a 32 megapixel sensor. It shoots 4K video up to 60p in 10-bit, and then it also has a fine video mode that downscales its 7K video to a 4K image on 4K 24p and 4K 30p. Now, I pretty much exclusively use this fine mode. We're recording in this fine mode right now, and the reason being is it's just more detailed than the regular 4K video modes in the EOS R7 that are line skipped. Now, that's not to say that the regular 4K video modes are bad by any means. There's just a lot more detail in the downscaled fine mode, and when I'm trying to match the EOS R7 with the R6, or I'm trying to even match it with the Komodo, having the most optimal image quality is definitely the best in my situations, so that's why I stick with the fine mode. But if you're just buying this camera for fun, or you don't need the most optimal image quality this camera can produce, or you need to shoot slow motion, then shooting in the 4K 60 modes, or really any of the regular 4K modes, you do get decent images out of them, just not as detailed. Now, aside from the 10-bit video modes, another reason I bought the R7 is the autofocus in this camera is absolutely fantastic. In some ways, I would say it tends to sometimes work even better than my R6, and that's probably because it inherited the same autofocusing system from the R3. When it comes to ports, the camera has pretty much the same ports that the R6 has. It's got a headphone jack, microphone jack, HDMI, that's a micro HDMI, which is a little bit of a pain, but not the end of the world. It has a USB-C port that does support power delivery, and that's how I power the camera a lot, especially when it's in this studio configuration, just so I don't have to worry about charging the little LPE6 batteries. Now, one thing that's interesting with the R7 compared to the R6 is the layout of its USB-C and micro HDMI. On the R6, I didn't like it quite as much because when I used a right-angle USB-C cord, the USB-C is actually on top of the micro HDMI on the R6. I really just couldn't use right-angle USB-C cords unless I had them going up instead of down, which in the end adds a little bit of strain to the cord. It's not the end of the world. For cable management, it's just not my favorite. On the R7, they flipped where the USB-C port and the micro HDMI port are, which again is great because in this scenario, I have my right-angled USB-C port and it's not covering at all the screen. So I don't have to add an external monitor. I can just look and see my framing to the right of the camera, and I don't really have anything in the way. So I do like that they reversed the HDMI and USB-C placement. That was actually a big deal that I didn't even think I needed. The camera uses the same LPE6NH batteries as the R5 and the R6. Originally, I didn't think that was going to be as big of a deal because, as I said earlier, I typically power these cameras via USB-C and I don't really care what battery I use. However, switching between the R6 and the R7 a lot, having the exact same battery does make it helpful. So again, I don't have to carry a bunch of different kind of batteries. I'm really using one kind of batteries for my mirrorless cameras. The flip screen is decent. It's not the highest quality flip screen. Also, same with the viewfinder. The viewfinder is decent. It's not the highest quality viewfinder. But in the end, the R7 is pretty much giving you the best bang for your buck out of any camera out there for its price point. The camera has some weather sealing. It's not a completely weather sealed camera, but it is more sealed than, for instance, the R10. So if that's a big factor for you, if you're going to be using this camera outside a lot, I would probably go for the R7 over the R10. Another really cool feature of the R7 that the R10 does not have is something that it got from the R5 and the R6, where when you turn off the camera, the shutter curtain actually covers the sensor, which is great because when I'm doing lens changes, if I'm somewhere like the beach and I want to change a lens really quick, I really have no issues, no worries about anything getting into the sensor itself because it's covered the whole time. And that's been a really cool feature that I've had coming to these Canon mirrorless RF cameras. Speaking of RF, yes, this camera has the RF mount, which means not only can you use Canon's full line of RF lenses, but you can also use their really cool EF adapters. For instance, I pretty much use the Canon VND on this camera all the time. Right now we're using the Sigma 18-35 with Canon's VND just so I could dial down the exact amount of ND I need so I can shoot wide open on the Sigma. Using these VNDs have been really helpful, especially for run and gun, because I don't have to bring a different VND for every single camera or lens I'm using. I pretty much can just swap out this VND between any of my RF cameras, from my R7 to my R6 to my Komodo, and I also don't have to necessarily worry about cleaning them every time because they're in between the camera and the lens, so there's really not much room for dust to get in there other than when you're changing lenses. Now, this camera having the RF mount may also be a con to some people, and that's really because there aren't really many RF mount lenses that are made for Super 35 APS-C right now. There are the kit lenses that the R7 and the R10 can be bundled with, and they're most likely going to be APS-C crop sensors coming out in the future. But at this time here in August of 2022, there really aren't that many crop sensor options for the R7. Now, that changes a little bit because there are tons of EF crop sensor options, like the Sigma 18-35 I'm being filled on right now. So the one thing I could tell you from experience is that if you're looking to pick up an R7 and you want to have the best image quality possible out of this camera, you're going to want to look into crop censored EF glass like the Sigma Art range to get the most out of it. Now, really the only negative that comes out of it, because autofocus seems to work really well with the Sigma 18-35 and the R7, so it really comes down to weight of your overall camera kit. And when you're adding the RF to EF adapter, then you're adding something like a Sigma 18-35, your overall kit does get much bigger. One of the things I never realized would happen is being able to use a full frame camera like the R6 and this small little 16mm lens. I have an extremely small profile to the point where I can stick this setup on this Crane M2S. Whereas on the R6, although I could stick that setup with this lens on the Crane M2S, because it's a crop sensor, you're not getting nearly the field of view that you do with the R6. And so you essentially at that point need to use a different lens if you need that same field of view. Again, that ends up adding weight. The lens that I typically use to match this field of view on the R7 is the Tokina 11-16, which is a great quality lens as well. But then the problem is you're adding a lot more weight to the camera, and it ends up weighing even more than this full frame option. So that's something really important to consider when using the R7, because the quality is great, but there are some workarounds that you have to do just because of its sensor size. Now, another factor that maybe can be attributed to its sensor size is the noise gate. Now, I'm not doing any crazy technical dynamic range tests with the R7 because I just don't have access to do tests like those right. But what I can tell you from experience is when you're shooting in C-Log3, the base ISO is ISO 800. Now, on a camera like the R6, that's not really an issue. But on the R7, shooting at a higher ISO like 800 is going to add more noise into your image. And the problem I've seen is because you really don't want to shoot lower than 800 when shooting in C-Log3, even on the R7, there is a lot more noise in the shadows of footage on the R7 compared to even a camera like the R6. Now, when you're in a well-lit scenario like we are right now, you don't really see that noise. Where you're gonna see that noise is in uneven lighting or super low light scenarios, especially compared to, again, cameras that can do it better like the R6 or the A7 III, the R5. You're just going to see that there is more noise in the image on the R7 compared to other cameras shooting at the same ISO that have larger sensors. To me, that's not a deal breaker, but it's absolutely something worth noting, and I said it in my first impressions video. It was the first thing I noticed. Before I started looking at the images on the computer, I can tell that in any of the shadow areas there just was more noise. Something you're gonna have to deal with. Again, not a deal breaker, but it is worth noting because you need to know when it will be there and when it won't be there. Now, another thing I noticed that only really happens in the fine mode. When you're shooting in the 4K fine mode, whether it's 24p, 30p, there is way more rolling shutter than shooting in the normal 4K modes on the R7. So if you plan on shooting in the 4K fine mode, this camera definitely works better on a tripod, for talking heads, pretty much anything that's not going to have a crazy amount of movement. Now, ever since I picked up the R7, I've been using it for all of my talking head videos, especially on YouTube, and it works absolutely fantastic for it. And it's nice to have a camera that I really just don't have to take off the tripod and I can leave there, and it has very similar image quality than using my R6, but also I can use my crop censored lenses and really get better image quality out of those crop censored lenses using it on the R7 than using those crop censored lenses on the R6. For me, I think the image quality out of this camera outweighs the cons of the rolling shutter, but that's for my uses. For your uses, if you plan on picking up the R7 as your main camera, and let's say you're gonna shoot a lot of action sports and you're gonna be panning the camera around a lot, if you're gonna be shooting in that 4K fine mode, you're gonna notice that immediately. Now, to be blunt, I haven't really used any of the standard color profiles in the R7 because I messed with a lot of them in the R6 and I know when and when not to use them, but for the most part, I'm always shooting in C-Log3, which is again yet another reason why I picked up the R7 over the R10, because I knew that C-Log3 was going to be what I filmed in most of the time, and having a camera that shot in C-Log3 versus having a camera that only did 10-bit in the HDR-PQ mode, which isn't bad, but there's not as much dynamic range in there as C-Log3. Plus, in the end, I'm also matching the R7 to the R6 a lot, so having that C-Log3 just makes things easy because for the most part, I'm doing the same color corrections to the R7 that I'm doing to the R6, which is really great. It just makes things really quick, really simple. I knew some people were complaining about the location of the dial and maybe hitting the thumbstick sometimes. Now, I'll be honest, sometimes I do hit the thumbstick when I'm hitting the rotation wheel. It's not a big deal for me, and it actually wasn't that hard to switch. Even switching back and forth between the different wheels on the R7 and the R6, it really hasn't been a big deal. Interesting that they made that change, and I don't know even yet if it's something I like or dislike. It's something that I've absolutely been able to deal with, so it hasn't been a pro or a con for me. It's just been a change, in my opinion, between the full frame cameras and the R7. One welcome addition to the R7 that the R6 doesn't have is the addition of the AF/MF switch physically on the body. Now, where that comes into play is a lot of the new RF lenses do not have an AF/MF switch on them. I mean, take a look at the 16mm right here. It has one switch. What this switch on the 16mm does is lets you switch between using this wheel as a focus wheel or a control wheel that you can manually program what you want the control wheel to be. So having an autofocus, manual focus toggle is really important to have instead of having to go through the camera's menu to toggle between autofocus and manual focus. I know friends of mine that have the EOS RP, and that's a big issue for them when they're trying to switch back and forth. When it comes to the screens, the flip screen is pretty much, in my opinion, just as easy to use as on the R6, so there's really no update there. Now, when it comes to a lot of the features that the R7 has inherited from some of the higher end mirrorless features, I'm not necessarily going to go over them because a lot of them are the same. However, the one last feature that I think is a really big deal for a lot of people shooting with XLR is the addition of the smart hot shoe on the top of the R7. Now, the R5 and the R6 do not have that ability. With the smart hot shoe, you can use devices from companies like Tascam, which give you the ability to add XLR functionality to the smart hot shoe, giving you somewhat internal XLR audio to cameras like the R7. And in that case, makes the R7 a proper video camera and a proper run and gun dock camera, because then at that point, if you're using EF lenses, you can use Canon's VND adapter and somewhat have internal VNDs. You have the ability to use XLR audio internally, and if you're shooting in the normal video modes, there really is no overheating. I barely get overheating in the fine video modes as I use them, but I do know long term, if you're recording for periods way over an hour with the fine video modes, you will somewhat get overheating. Those features really turn the R7 into a powerhouse video camera. Now, a minor issue I have with the actual body of the R7, which you would never know without actually testing this camera, is the actual area where the lens mount is on the bottom of the camera when you mount it to gimbals. When you're using gimbals, and I'll use this Zhiyun Crane M2S for example, some of them have this little lip on their quick release plates. Now, on most cameras, that lip doesn't affect anything. You just have the little lip there, and it kind of just keeps the camera on the quick release a little bit more stable. Now, on the R7, unlike the R6, which you can see there's a little bit of room between this lip and the RF lens mount, the RF lens mount on the R7 goes all the way down to the bottom of the camera body. Where that becomes an issue is you can't fit the R7 on this kind of quick release plate. Zhiyun Crane M2S has a few different kinds of quick release plates. However, that involves, changing out this whole plate bottom base right here, so it becomes a little bit more cumbersome. And then also, when you change out this base plate and use a different one, you actually have to use a completely different quick release system, which is nowhere near as good as this. That's really a subject for another video, but it is worth noting that when using the R7, because of how low the RF mount is, there may be certain situations that you try to mount the camera that the mount just may, quite frankly, get in the way. Another thing relating to gimbals is also the size and weight of the R7. Now, it is smaller and lighter than a camera like the R6. What is interesting about it is the way it distributes weight on the R7 on a gimbal like the Crane M2S isn't much different than using an R6. So where I thought that I would actually be able to use heavier lenses on the R7 due to the weight difference between that and the R6, for instance, I thought I'd be able to use the RF 35mm on the R7, where the heaviest lens I can use on this gimbal with the R6 is the 16mm. Well, it seems that I can really only use the 16mm with the R6 as well, which then kind of defeats the purpose because the 16mm is nowhere near as wide on the R6 as it is on the R7. So I pretty much leave the R6 on here just so I can have a really wide field of view on this super small gimbal. I mean, this thing probably weighs less than the camera itself. It's not a big deal if you're not using gimbals like the Zhiyun Crane M2S. However, if you are, it is absolutely worth noting because you will run into that problem. Now, I want to talk about who I think this camera is aimed at. I think it's aimed at a bunch of different kinds of videographers, photographers, and I think that's why this camera, because ticks off so many different checkboxes, is really Canon's camera aimed at everybody. Now, not everybody can afford a $1,500 camera, I understand that. I think there's somebody at every single skill level that could find a feature on the EOS R7 that absolutely makes it worth purchasing for them. When it comes to photography, I can obviously see wildlife photographers, anyone shooting birds, things that are kind of still but out in the distance. They could take advantage of having the crop on the crop sensor and shooting higher megapixel at 32 megapixels and getting really nice quality images. Now, sports photographers, although you can absolutely use this to shoot sports, definitely make sure you don't use electronic shutter mode, because the rolling shutter in electronic shutter mode is really bad, just like when shooting in the fine video mode. So sports photographers, I could see using it as long as you use this camera to its strengths. Now, when it comes to video, to simplify the video uses, I think that this camera, if you're filming somebody else or if you're filming a subject, this camera will work like any of the other cameras in Canon's lineup really well for that. If you're filming yourself, if you're on a tripod and you have a little bit of distance between you and your subject, like I do right here with my tripod, I think you can absolutely film yourself. But when it comes to vlogging, that's a completely other issue. And it's not that I wouldn't recommend the R7 for vlogging, but there's a few issues I've encountered. Now, as you saw with the size of the R6 using a lens like the 16mm, the profile of the R6 is really relatively small. And yes, you can use that 16mm on the R7, or you can use a kit lens with the R7. However, you're not going to get quite as wide of a field of view, at least at this point in time using those lenses. At that point, you're going to have to use a lens like Tokina's 11-16 to vlog. Now, people have done that before, but when you see the size and weight difference between using the 16mm or just really small wide-angle pancake lenses, when you're holding up the camera, you're vlogging, you're filming yourself, weight is an issue. And I think the problem with using a lens like the Tokina 11-16 to vlog with the R7 is then you are adding a decent amount more weight to a camera that's supposed to be really light, and then on top of that, it's not equalized weight. So at that point, you're using the RF to EF adapter, which then puts the lens further out in front of the camera, and then you just have a weight distribution issue in order to vlog. For my specific uses, I don't see the R7 replacing the R6 as a vlog camera, especially now that Canon has released that firmware update that makes the IBIS wobble much better on the R6. So I can use something like the 16mm, vlog with it. I did a video on it, I'll put a link in the description below. But just because of the weight distribution, the R7 almost becomes my camera that I am going to kit up, and then the R6 becomes the camera that I'm not going to kit out and try to make it as small as possible. If you're doing a lot of run and gun work, documentary, you're using this camera to film other subjects, I think as long as it's not in extremely low light, the R7 will really tick off a lot of boxes for pretty much any kind of videographer, filmmaker that's looking to have a camera like the R7 with really good quality 10-bit video, have IBIS, and also have amazing autofocus. So I think wedding videographers are going to love this camera as a secondary camera. Some may even use it as a primary camera. A lot of event videographers are going to love this camera. Anybody who's already in the Canon ecosystem, you have multiple Canon RF cameras at this point, maybe a lot of the full frame mirrorless, and you want a secondary camera in your lineup that's not going to break the bank, the R7's absolutely going to work, especially because of the C-Log3. Again, that's one of the reasons I didn't pick up the R10, because although I would like to have a camera with no image stabilization, the R10 doesn't have C-Log3, and I don't know if they're ever going to add C-Log3 in it, especially because it may cannibalize sales of the R7. So the R7 works as a really great B camera. And then for those who are budget conscious and you don't want to go and get a camera that's more expensive than the R7, I think the R7 will work really great for you as an A camera. You just have to know and work with its quirks, which there aren't that many, but just be aware of them and you can absolutely use the camera as an A camera. I do have some videos coming out soon with lenses that are made for APS-C cameras and our RF mount, like this TT Artisan fisheye lens, so I'll have a video on this soon. I'll also have a video coming out with a Surrey anamorphic 35mm that's made for Super 35 APS-C glass. I got the new RF version of that lens coming in soon, so I'll be doing a review with that on the R7 as well as the Red Komodo, so make sure you stay tuned for that. I wanted to do this video because there's obviously some pros and some cons to the R7 that on spec you don't really know what those pros and cons are going to be, but through regular use you absolutely find them out, and the R7 is no slouch. I think it is the best camera for anybody looking to get into a 4K 60, 4K 30 camera with 10-bit at this price point. So I do highly recommend it for anybody who wants to get into the Canon ecosystem. If you have any questions about the EOS R7, or you actually have content that you haven't seen me do yet that you want to see, please ask in the comments below. I have a lot of content on the R7 that I've already done, so I'll put a link to the playlist that kind of shows all of the different videos I've done with the R7, and that's allowed me to not cover things like speed boosters or specific lenses, but I have videos covering that, so make sure to check out that playlist at your earliest convenience. Till next time, thank you for watching, everybody. My name is Geoff Fagien, and I will see you in the next video.